The Velker Dominion, an empire of unparalleled cruelty and strength, had ruled the galaxy for centuries, spreading fear and domination wherever its fleets ventured. At its helm was High Warden Zorth, a figure of cold calculation and merciless ambition. Under his command, the Dominion expanded relentlessly, crushing all resistance and enslaving countless worlds. To Zorth, the Terran system was little more than a speck of dust, a backwater region inhabited by a primitive species barely worth noticing. But something had changed. Whispers of resistance began to ripple through the Dominion's networks. Velker scouting vessels sent to the Terran borders had gone silent, their signals vanishing into the void. Reports of human ships, crude yet strangely effective, striking back against Velker patrols began to emerge. The humans, once considered harmless, had developed hyperspace technology, a feat that should have been beyond their grasp. Zorth, intrigued and enraged, ordered Admiral Threx, one of his most seasoned commanders, to lead a fleet to the Zeta Crucible system and crush this insolence. Threx, a towering figure with crimson eyes and a sneer of disdain, considered the mission beneath him. To him, the Terrans were insects, weak, disorganized, and destined to be obliterated. His fleet of sleek, obsidian warships gleamed with the Dominion's deadly precision, each vessel a testament to centuries of conquest. As the Velker fleet approached the Zeta Crucible, the void around them was silent, eerily so. The stars seemed dimmer, as if the universe itself held its breath. Threx stood on the bridge of his flagship, arms crossed, his confidence unshaken. He expected a quick and decisive victory. Then, the ironclad arrived. It did not emerge from hyperspace with grace or elegance. It tore into reality with a thunderous shockwave, its jagged silhouette cutting through the darkness like a blade. The ship was monstrous, its hull blackened and scarred, as if forged in the fires of vengeance. Its design was alien to the Velker, brutal, unrelenting, and devoid of the sleek artistry they prided themselves on. The ironclad was not built for beauty, it was built for destruction. For a moment, silence reigned on the Velker bridge as Admiral Threx and his crew stared at the Terran warship. Then, the ironclad opened fire. The first volley was unlike anything the Velker had ever encountered. Beams of shimmering energy, the experimental graviton lances, lanced out from the ironclad, bending space itself as they struck their targets. Velker cruisers, crafted with the finest Dominion technology, crumpled like paper under the assault. Hulls twisted and shattered, their fragments spiraling into the void. The screams of Velker crews echoed across the COMM channels before being abruptly silenced. Panic spread through the Velker fleet. Their formations broke apart as captains scrambled to evade the devastating firepower of the ironclad. Admiral Threx barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding, but even he could not deny the growing unease in his chest. This was no ordinary human vessel. This was a weapon of war, a harbinger of destruction. On the bridge of the ironclad, Captain Elias Kale stood tall, his expression grim and unyielding. His piercing eyes scanned the battlefield, calculating every move with precision. Kale was no stranger to the Velker. Years ago, they had descended upon his colony, leaving nothing but ash and ruin. He had lost everything: his family, his home, his future. Now, he commanded humanity's most advanced warship, and he carried the weight of vengeance on his shoulders. The ironclad moved with purpose, weaving through the chaos it had unleashed. It was a predator among prey, its weapons tearing through Velker ships with merciless efficiency. Kale's voice, calm yet filled with an edge of cold fury, echoed across the bridge. "Target their flagship," he ordered. The ironclad's graviton lances focused on Threx's command ship, a massive vessel bristling with weaponry. The Velker flagship fired back, its plasma cannons lighting up the void, but the ironclad's shields absorbed the onslaught with ease. Within moments, The flagship's defenses crumbled under the relentless assault. Explosions rippled across its hull, and the once mighty vessel began to break apart. Admiral Threx, for the first time in his long career, felt fear. His fleet was in ruins, his flagship a burning wreck. He watched helplessly as the ironclad turned its attention to the remaining Velker ships, picking them off one by one. The humans were not the weaklings he had believed them to be. They were something far more dangerous, something the Dominion had underestimated. As the Velker fleet retreated, their pride shattered and their losses immeasurable, a transmission from the ironclad cut through the static. The voice of Captain Kale was calm, yet it carried a weight that chilled the blood of every Velker who heard it. "You came to conquer," Kale said, his words deliberate and sharp. "Now, you will learn what it means to fear." The transmission ended, leaving only silence in its wake. The ironclad lingered for a moment, its dark silhouette framed by the wreckage of the Velker fleet. Then, it vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the remnants of Dominion arrogance. For the first time in centuries, the Velker Dominion had been defeated. And for the first time, they knew fear. The ironclad's graviton lances, humanity's newest and most dangerous weapon, were designed not just to destroy, but to humiliate. The way they bent and twisted enemy ships into grotesque shapes before obliterating them was a deliberate message. Humanity had suffered long enough, and now it was their turn to inflict pain. Captain Kale's backstory added depth to his character. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a man haunted by loss. Every decision he made, every order he gave, was driven by the memory of his family and the burning desire to ensure no other human would suffer as he had. His personal vendetta against the Velker gave the story a raw emotional core, making his triumphs feel all the more poignant and his struggles all the more harrowing. This was not just a battle, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Humanity, once dismissed and forgotten, had awakened. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Velker Dominion, once an unshakable pillar of galactic dominance, now trembled under the weight of a single, devastating truth: they had been defeated. The news of the massacre at Zeta Crucible spread like wildfire through the Dominion's vast expanse, igniting whispers of doubt and fear among its people. For centuries, the Dominion had been an unstoppable force, its fleets carving paths of blood and fire across the stars. But now, for the first time, its enemies had struck back and won. High Warden Zorth, the iron-fisted ruler of the Dominion, stood in the heart of the Obsidian Citadel, a fortress of blackened stone and shimmering crimson light that loomed over Velker Prime. His piercing gaze swept over the faces of the Grand Tribunal, a council of warlords, admirals, and cunning strategists. The chamber was vast and cold, its walls adorned with ancient banners and trophies from countless conquests, but now the air was thick with unease. The once proud council, whose members prided themselves on their unity and strength, was fracturing under the weight of their defeat. Zorth's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "How," he demanded, his tone low and venomous, "did a primitive species like the Terrans achieve this? How did they destroy one of our fleets?" His eyes burned with fury, daring anyone to challenge him. General Varnoak, a towering figure with a scarred face and a reputation for pragmatism, stepped forward. His voice was calm but carried an edge of warning. "The Terrans are no longer the weaklings we once believed them to be. Their technology has advanced at an alarming rate. They are learning, adapting faster than we anticipated." A ripple of discontent spread through the chamber. Some warlords scoffed, their arrogance blinding them to the gravity of the situation. "They are nothing more than insects," one sneered. This victory was a fluke. "Crush them now, and they will scatter like the vermin they are." But Varnoak's expression darkened. "And what if they don't scatter? What if this is only the beginning? We cannot afford to underestimate them again." The Terrans have proven they are capable of striking at our fleets. If we do nothing, they will grow bolder, stronger. Zorth's gaze lingered on Varnoke for a moment, his mind churning with thoughts of betrayal and ambition. The Dominion had always been a fractured empire, held together by fear and the promise of power. Now, the cracks were widening. He could see it in the eyes of the warlords, in the way their whispers grew louder, their loyalty wavering. The Terrans were not just a threat to the Dominion's borders, they were a threat to its very foundation. Far from the cold halls of the Obsidian Citadel, on the blue-green world of Earth, the mood was no less tense. The victory at Zeta Crucible had sent shockwaves through humanity, inspiring both hope and fear. For the first time, humanity had struck back against an enemy that had seemed invincible. But the cost of that victory weighed heavily on the Terran High Council, a group of leaders tasked with guiding humanity through this perilous new chapter. The council chamber was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Velker Tribunal. It was a simple, functional room, designed for practicality rather than intimidation. The air buzzed with heated debate as the council members argued over their next move. "Striking back is madness," one counselor exclaimed, his voice trembling with fear. "We've won one battle, but at what cost? If we provoke the Dominion further, they will retaliate with everything they have. We must fortify our defenses and prepare for the worst." Another counselor, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice, countered, "And if we wait, they will come to us. Do you think the Velker will simply forget this humiliation? No. They will come, and when they do, we must be ready to meet them on our terms, not theirs." At the center of the room stood Captain Elias Kale, his presence commanding despite the scars of battle etched into his face. He had seen firsthand what the Velker were capable of. He had watched them burn his home, destroy his family, and slaughter countless innocents. To him, there was no question of what needed to be done. "We cannot wait," Kale said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of steel. "The Velker see hesitation as weakness. If we hide behind our defenses, they will crush us. The only way to survive is to strike first. To show them that humanity will not kneel." The council fell silent, the weight of Kale's words settling over them like a storm cloud. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a new voice broke the silence. "I agree with Captain Kale," said Admiral Selene Myra, stepping forward. Her presence was calm and composed, but her eyes betrayed the sharp intellect behind them. Myra was known for her caution, her ability to see the long game, but even she could not deny the truth in Kale's words. "But if we are to strike, it must be with precision. Recklessness will only lead to our ruin. We need a plan, one that ensures we hit them where it hurts most." Kale nodded, a flicker of respect passing between him and Myra. He knew she was right. Humanity's survival depended not just on courage, but on strategy. Together, they began to outline a bold plan, to take the fight to the Dominion, targeting key supply lines and communication hubs to weaken their grip on the galaxy. Meanwhile, back in the Dominion, the cracks in its foundation were growing deeper. Behind closed doors, warlords plotted and schemed, each vying for power in the chaos. Some saw the Terrans as an opportunity, a chance to weaken Zorth and claim the throne for themselves. Others, like General Varnoke, remained loyal to the Dominion but feared that its arrogance would lead to its downfall. In the shadows of the Obsidian Citadel, Zorth brooded. He could feel the tides turning, the balance of power shifting. The Terrans were a threat unlike any the Dominion had faced before, not because of their strength, but because of their defiance. They were not afraid. And that, more than anything, made them dangerous. As the Dominion teetered on the edge of chaos and humanity prepared for its next move, the galaxy held its breath. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the stars, a battle not just for survival, but for the soul of two civilizations. The stars stretched endlessly around the Terran task force as they ventured deeper into Velker-controlled space. The void was eerily silent, the only sound within the ironclad the hum of its engines and the quiet murmurs of the crew. Captain Elias Kale stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the holographic map before him. The targets were marked in crimson: supply depots, communication relays, the lifelines of the Velker Dominion. He knew what was at stake. Every strike was a message, a warning to the Dominion that humanity would no longer cower in the shadows. The ironclad led the charge, its jagged silhouette cutting through the darkness like a predator on the hunt. Behind it, smaller Terran vessels followed, their crews tense but resolute. These were not soldiers born into war, they were miners, engineers, scientists, ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary fight. Yet, they fought with a determination that burned brighter than any star. The first raid was swift and brutal. The Velker supply depot loomed in the distance, a massive structure of blackened steel and glowing red lights. It floated in the void, surrounded by smaller patrol ships that moved in lazy, predictable patterns. The Terran fleet struck without warning. Beams of energy lanced through the darkness, tearing through Velker ships before they could react. Explosions lit up the void, casting eerie shadows across the depot's surface. Velker defenders scrambled to respond, but the Terrans were already moving, their ships darting in and out like wolves among sheep. Kale watched the chaos unfold from the bridge, his expression unreadable. "No mercy," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the crew around him. "They showed us none. We'll return the favor." The ironclad's weapons roared, its graviton lances tearing through the depot's defenses. Within minutes, the structure was a burning wreck, its supplies scattered into the void. The Terran fleet disappeared into hyperspace before the Velker reinforcements could arrive, leaving only destruction in their wake. But the Velker were not a foe easily broken. For every raid, for every victory, the Dominion adapted. High Warden Zorth, enraged by the Terrans' audacity, unleashed a new weapon onto the battlefield, the Shadow Fangs. These sleek, predatory cruisers were unlike anything the Terrans had encountered. Their hulls shimmered with cloaking technology, rendering them invisible to most sensors. Their plasma cannons could tear through even the ironclad's formidable shields. And at their helm was Captain Nazar, a name whispered with both fear and respect among the Velker. Nazar was a creature of shadows, his mind as sharp as the blade he carried at his side. He studied the Terran raids with a cold, calculating precision, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. To him, the Terrans were a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be conquered. And he relished the hunt. The ambush came without warning. The Terran fleet, fresh from another successful raid, was navigating a dense asteroid field when the Shadow Fangs struck. They emerged from the darkness like phantoms, their cloaking fields dropping just long enough to unleash devastating volleys of plasma fire. The first Terran ship exploded in a blinding flash, its crew lost before they could even cry out. Panic rippled through the fleet as the Shadow Fangs darted between the asteroids, their movements precise and deadly. On the ironclad, alarms blared as the ship shuddered under the assault. Sparks flew from damaged consoles, and the acrid smell of burning circuitry filled the air. Kale gripped the edge of the command console, his knuckles white. "Evasive maneuvers," he barked. "Return fire focus on the shadows." But it was no use. The Shadow Fangs were too fast, too elusive. Plasma bolts rained down on the ironclad, scorching its hull and leaving deep, jagged scars. The crew fought valiantly, but the odds were against them. For a moment, it seemed as though the Terran fleet would be annihilated. Then, in a desperate gamble, Kale ordered the fleet to scatter. The smaller Terran ships broke formation, drawing the Shadow Fangs away from the ironclad. It was a chaotic, dangerous maneuver, but it bought them the time they needed. The ironclad, battered and burning, limped into hyperspace, its surviving escorts following close behind. The aftermath of the ambush was grim. The ironclad returned to Terran space as a shadow of its former self. Its once imposing hull was scorched and pitted, its corridors filled with the sounds of repair crews working tirelessly to patch the damage. The crew was shaken, their confidence rattled by the ferocity of the Velker counterattack. Kale stood in the ship's infirmary, his gaze heavy as he looked at the injured crew members lying on the beds. Some were unconscious, their faces pale and drawn. Others stared at the ceiling with hollow eyes, the horrors of the battle replaying in their minds. Kale felt the weight of their suffering like a stone in his chest. He had led them into the fight, and he had nearly led them to their deaths. But amidst the despair, there was also resilience. The crew of the ironclad was more than just a fighting force, they were a family. Bonds forged in the fires of war grew stronger as they supported one another, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of solace. Kale watched as a young engineer, her arm in a sling, helped an injured pilot adjust his oxygen mask. Another crew member, his face streaked with soot, handed out rations with a weary smile. They were battered, but they were not broken. Kale knew they couldn't afford another defeat. The Velker were learning, adapting with every encounter. If humanity was to survive, they would need to do the same. He summoned the ship's engineers and scientists, their faces still pale from the battle, and gave them a single, urgent order: find a way to see them before they see us. The engineers worked tirelessly, poring over data and schematics, their minds racing to outthink the Velker. They developed advanced gravimetric sensors, devices capable of detecting the subtle distortions in space caused by cloaked ships. It was a risky, untested technology, but it was their best hope. As the ironclad prepared for its next mission, Kale found himself standing alone on the observation deck, staring out at the stars. The void stretched endlessly before him, cold and unforgiving. He thought of Captain Nazar, the cunning Velker tactician who had nearly destroyed them. He thought of the crew members they had lost, their faces flashing through his mind like ghosts. And he thought of the battles yet to come. Kale's hand tightened into a fist. The Velker had dealt them a heavy blow, but humanity would rise again. They would adapt, they would fight, and they would endure. The war was far from over, and Kale was determined to ensure that the next time the ironclad faced the Shadow Fangs, it would be the Velker who fled in fear. The ironclad drifted silently through the void, its engines humming softly as it patrolled the outer edges of Terran-controlled space. The ship's corridors were quiet, the crew going about their routines with a sense of uneasy calm. The scars from the last battle still marred the ship's hull, a haunting reminder of the Shadow Fang ambush. Yet, amidst the silence, there was an unspoken determination, a shared understanding that every moment of peace was fleeting, and danger could strike at any time. And strike it did. The attack came without warning. The first sign was a deafening explosion that rocked the ironclad to its core, sending crew members tumbling to the ground. Alarms blared, red lights flashing in every corridor as the ship's automated systems scrambled to assess the damage. Then came the sound of tearing metal, a horrifying screech that echoed through the ship as the Velker Bloodbound breached the hull. The Bloodbound were not ordinary soldiers. They were monsters, nightmares made flesh. Genetically enhanced and trained from birth for one purpose: destruction. They moved with an unnatural grace, their black armor glinting faintly in the dim emergency lights. Their faces, partially obscured by dark visors, bore cruel, angular features, and their glowing red eyes seemed to pierce straight into the souls of those who dared to face them. Each carried weapons designed for brutality, serrated blades that tore through flesh with ease, and energy rifles that hummed with deadly precision. The crew of the Ironclad had faced many horrors in their fight against the Velker, but nothing had prepared them for this. The Bloodbound moved like shadows, slipping through the ship's corridors with terrifying speed. They struck with precision, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Bodies fell, blood pooling on the cold metal floors as the invaders carved a path toward the bridge. Kale was on the bridge when the attack began. The ship shuddered violently beneath his feet, and the sound of distant gunfire reached his ears. His heart pounded, but his expression remained calm, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. "Report," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They've breached the hull," a crew member stammered, her hands trembling as she worked at her console. "Decks 4 and 5 are compromised. They are heading for the bridge." Kale's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. The Velker weren't here to destroy the Ironclad. They were here for him. "Seal the bulkheads," he ordered. "Alert all hands, prepare for close quarters combat." The crew sprang into action, their fear tempered by the resolve in Kale's voice. Weapons were drawn, and makeshift barricades were erected as they prepared to defend their ship. Kale grabbed his own weapon, a plasma blade that hummed softly as he activated it. He wasn't just a captain, he was a soldier, and he would fight alongside his crew to the bitter end. The battle that followed was nothing short of carnage. The Bloodbound poured into the Ironclad like a tide of darkness, their blades flashing as they cut down Terran defenders. The ship's corridors became a battlefield, the air thick with the smell of blood and burning metal. The screams of the dying echoed through the halls, mingling with the sharp crack of gunfire and the hiss of energy weapons. Kale fought at the front lines, his blade a blur as he cut through the bloodbound warriors. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, but each strike carried the weight of his fury. These creatures had invaded his ship, slaughtered his crew, and he would make them pay for every life they took. Around him, his crew fought with a desperation born of survival. Engineers wielded wrenches and makeshift weapons, while medics abandoned their posts to join the fray. It was chaos, but it was also unity, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of humanity. In the midst of the chaos, a bloodbound commander emerged, a towering figure clad in black armor etched with crimson runes. His presence was suffocating, his movements deliberate and deadly. He carried a massive blade that seemed to hum with dark energy, and his voice, when he spoke, was like the growl of a predator. "Kale," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "Your defiance ends here?" Kale stepped forward, his blade raised. His body ached from the countless battles he had fought, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. "If you want me," he said, his voice steady, "you'll have to go through me." The duel that followed was brutal, a clash of strength and skill. The bloodbound commander struck with the force of a storm, his blade carving through the air with lethal precision. Kale dodged and parried, his movements fueled by adrenaline and sheer willpower. Sparks flew as their blades clashed, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the corridor. The fight seemed to stretch on forever, each strike and counterstrike a test of endurance. Kale's body screamed in protest as the commander's blade grazed his side, leaving a deep, searing wound. Blood soaked his uniform, but he refused to fall. With a roar of defiance, he lunged forward, his blade finding its mark. The commander staggered, a look of shock crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground. The death of the bloodbound commander turned the tide of the battle. Inspired by Kale's victory, the crew rallied, pushing back the remaining invaders. But the cost was high. Bodies littered the corridors, and the ship itself groaned under the strain of the attack. Among the fallen was Lieutenant Arden, a bright and courageous officer who had been a pillar of strength for the crew. Arden's sacrifice was a moment of heartbreak and heroism. When a breached compartment threatened to depressurize the entire deck, she made the impossible choice. With a tearful farewell, she sealed herself inside, locking the hatch from within to protect the rest of the crew. Her final words, spoken over the comms, were a reminder of what they were fighting for. "Keep fighting," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she must have felt. "Don't let them win." The crew mourned her loss, their grief a heavy weight that hung over the ship. But even in their sorrow, they found strength. Arden's sacrifice became a rallying cry, a symbol of the resilience and courage that defined humanity. As the last of the bloodbound were driven from the ship, the ironclad fell silent once more. The corridors, once filled with the sounds of battle, were now eerily quiet. Cale stood on the bridge, his body battered and his uniform stained with blood. He looked around at his crew, their faces pale but resolute, and felt a surge of pride. They had survived. They had fought back against the darkness and emerged stronger for it. But Cale knew this was only the beginning. The Velker would not stop, and neither would he. The cost of war was high, and the scars it left would never truly heal. But as long as there was breath in his lungs, he would fight. For Arden. For his crew. For humanity. The ironclad loomed in the shadow of distant stars, its hull scarred but unbroken, as it approached the Velker nexus. The station was a behemoth, an intricate lattice of blackened steel and pulsating crimson lights, suspended in the void like a great, predatory spider's web. It was the heart of the Dominion's communication network, the unseen thread that held their fleets together. To destroy it would be to blind the Velker, to sever their control. But the Nexus was no easy target. Its defenses bristled with weaponry, and the space around it shimmered with the faint outlines of cloaked Velker ships, waiting to strike. Cale stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the holographic display of the Nexus. His face was a mask of grim determination, but beneath it lay a storm of emotions: fear, resolve, guilt. He knew the cost of what he was about to ask of his crew. He had seen it in their eyes, the unspoken question, how much more must we sacrifice, but the answer was always the same. As much as it takes. We strike fast, Cale said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The EMP will disable their defenses long enough for us to hit the core. Once the Nexus is down, we retreat. No heroics. The crew nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They trusted him, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of their minds. They had no choice. The attack began in a flash of light and fury. The Terran fleet emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of hornets, their weapons blazing as they targeted the Nexus's outer defenses. Velker turrets roared to life, spitting streams of plasma that tore through the darkness. Explosions lit up the void, casting eerie shadows across the station's surface. The ironclad led the charge, its hull shuddering as enemy fire raked across its shields. Cale barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. Deploy the EMP. Now. A sleek Terran frigate broke formation, weaving through the storm of enemy fire. Its engines flared as it raced toward the Nexus, carrying the EMP device that would turn the tide of the battle. The crew watched in tense silence as the frigate drew closer, its path illuminated by the fiery debris of fallen ships. Then, with a blinding flash, the EMP detonated. A wave of crackling energy rippled outward, washing over the Nexus and its defenses. The station's lights flickered and died, and the turrets fell silent. For a moment, there was only stillness. Now! Cale shouted. All ships, focus fire on the core? The Terran fleet surged forward, their weapons tearing into the exposed station. The Nexus groaned under the assault, its skeletal structure crumbling as explosions rippled through its core. The sight was both awe-inspiring and horrific, a monument to the cost of war. But victory came at a price. The Velker, even in their disarray, fought with ferocity. Terran ships fell one by one, their hulls torn apart by desperate counterattacks. The ironclad itself was battered, its corridors filled with the acrid stench of smoke and blood. Kale watched the destruction unfold, his chest tightening with every loss. When the Nexus finally collapsed, its remains swallowed by the void, a cheer went up among the surviving crew. But Kale felt no triumph. His eyes lingered on the wreckage of Terran ships, on the names of the fallen scrolling across his console. This was no victory. It was survival, bought with blood. As the fleet retreated, a discovery was made among the Nexus's ruins: hidden data files, encrypted but tantalizingly incomplete. The fragments spoke of a Velker superweapon, a device capable of annihilating entire planets. Kale's stomach churned as he read the reports. The war was far from over, and the stakes had just grown unimaginably higher. In the aftermath, tensions simmered. Admiral Myra confronted Kale in a dimly lit war room, her voice sharp with anger. "How many more lives, Kale? How many more ships will you throw into the fire for your reckless plans?" Kale met her gaze, his expression hard. "Every life we lose is a step closer to ending this war. If we hesitate, if we falter, the Velker will crush us." Myra's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And what will be left of us when it's over? If you keep this up, Kale, you won't have a fleet left to save." The Terran fleet was still reeling from the losses at the Nexus when the Velker unleashed their next weapon. The Void Claws came without warning, emerging from the darkness like specters. These ancient warships were relics of a long-forgotten Velker civil war, their hulls marked with the scars of battles fought centuries ago. But their age did not diminish their power. Their experimental energy shields shimmered like liquid light, deflecting even the strongest Terran weapons. And their particle cannons were devastating, tearing through ships with merciless precision. The ambush began as the ironclad led a raid on a Velker refinery. The refinery was a sprawling complex of pipes and towers, its surface bathed in a sickly glow of molten metal. The Terran fleet moved in cautiously, their weapons trained on the station's defenses. But before they could strike, the Void Claws appeared. The first blast came from nowhere, a beam of searing energy that sliced through a Terran frigate. The ship exploded in a fiery burst, its remains scattering into the void. Panic rippled through the fleet as the Void Claws revealed themselves, their dark, angular forms emerging from the shadows. Kale's heart sank as he watched the enemy ships advance. "All hands, battle stations," he shouted. "Focus fire on their shields, find a weakness." But the Void Claws were relentless. Their shields absorbed the Terran attacks, and their cannons rained destruction on the fleet. The ironclad shook violently as enemy fire tore through its defenses. Crew members were thrown from their stations, their screams lost in the chaos. Desperation clawed at Kale's mind as he searched for a way to turn the tide. Then, he remembered the gravimetric sensors and experimental technology developed after their encounter with the Shadow Fangs. If the sensors could detect distortions in space, perhaps they could reveal a flaw in the Void Claw's shields. "Activate the sensors," Kale ordered. "Find me a weakness." The crews scrambled to comply, their hands flying over consoles as the ship shuddered around them. Moments later, a faint distortion appeared on the display, a flicker in the Void Claw's shields, barely perceptible but enough to exploit. "There!" Kale shouted. "Target the distortion, concentrate all fire." The ironclad unleashed a barrage of weapons fire, striking the vulnerable point in the nearest Void Claw's shield. The shield flickered and failed, and the Terran fleet seized the opportunity. Beams of energy tore into the enemy ship, reducing it to a smoldering wreck. The battle raged on, each victory hard won. By the time the last Void Claw fell, the ironclad was barely holding together. Fires raged in its corridors, and the air was thick with smoke. The crew, battered and bloodied, clung to their stations as the ship limped away from the battlefield. In the aftermath, the psychological toll of the war became impossible to ignore. Kale sat alone in his quarters, his hands trembling as he stared at the blood-stained uniform draped over a chair. The faces of the fallen haunted him, their voices echoing in his mind. He had led them into battle, into death, and he could feel the weight of their loss pressing down on him like a physical force. Among the crew, whispers of doubt began to spread. Was the fight worth the cost? How much more could they endure? The victories felt hollow, each one leaving them more broken than the last. But Kale knew there was no turning back. The Velker would not stop, and neither could they. The cost of war was steep, but the cost of surrender would be far greater. For now, all they could do was fight and hope that, one day, the sacrifices would lead to something more than just survival. The sky above Velker Prime burned with the light of battle. From the bridge of the ironclad, Kale stared at the planet below, a dark, swirling world cloaked in storms and shadow. It was the beating heart of the Dominion, a fortress world that had never known defeat. Its surface was a maze of towering spires, blackened cities, and endless war factories, all protected by a shield of orbital defenses that bristled with deadly precision. To attack here was madness. To succeed was impossible. And yet, Kale had no choice. The fleet was small, a fraction of what the Terrans had once commanded. The ships were battered, their hulls scarred from countless battles, but they moved with purpose, their engines leaving trails of light in the void. The crew aboard the ironclad worked in tense silence, their faces pale but resolute. They knew this was the final push, the last gamble in a war that had cost them everything. Victory or death, there was no other outcome. Kale's voice broke the silence, calm but unyielding. We break through their defenses. No hesitation. No retreat. His eyes swept over the bridge crew, meeting their gazes. They think this world is untouchable. Let's show them they are wrong. The assault began with fire and fury. The Terran fleet surged forward, weapons blazing as they targeted the Dominion's orbital defenses. Velker warships swarmed to meet them, their sleek, angular forms cutting through the void like predators. The battle was chaos. Explosions lit up the darkness, and the airwaves were filled with the desperate cries of dying crews. The ironclad led the charge, its hull shuddering under the relentless onslaught. Kale stood at the center of the chaos, his voice steady as he directed the fleet. Focus fire on the main defense platform. We need a breach. The ship rocked violently as enemy fire struck its shields, but the crew held their ground, their determination unshaken. Finally, with a deafening explosion, the main platform crumbled. The path to the planet was open, but at a terrible cost. Half the Terran fleet was gone, their remains drifting silently in the void. Kale's heart ached as he watched the debris fields, but he pushed the pain aside. There was no time for mourning. Not yet. The ironclad descended through the storm-choked skies of Velker Prime, its engines screaming as it dodged enemy fire. The planet's surface was a nightmare, a wasteland of jagged metal and scorched earth, lit by the eerie glow of molten rivers. The Supreme Command Spire loomed in the distance, a monolith of black stone and crimson light that seemed to pierce the heavens. It was there that the Dominion's leaders hid, and it was there that Kale would end this war. Kale led the ground assault himself, his boots crunching against the scorched ground as he moved with his troops. The air was thick with ash and the acrid stench of burning metal. Around him, the sounds of battle-raged explosions, the crackle of energy weapons, the screams of the wounded. But Kale's focus was unshakable. Each step brought him closer to the spire, closer to the end. The spire's defenses were formidable, but Kale's tactical brilliance turned the tide. He led his troops through the labyrinthine corridors, using the environment to outmaneuver the Velker forces. Every inch of ground was fought for, every victory paid for in blood. By the time they reached the inner sanctum, Kale's forces were battered and exhausted, but their resolve burned brighter than ever. High Warden Zorth awaited Kale at the summit of the spire. The chamber was vast and cold, its walls lined with glowing red inscriptions that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. Zorth stood at its center, a towering figure clad in ornate black armor etched with crimson symbols. His presence was suffocating, a palpable weight that pressed down on Kale and his troops. "You've come far, Terran," Zorth said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "But this is where your defiance ends." Kale stepped forward, his blade in hand. The weapon hummed softly, its light casting sharp shadows across his face. "Your dominion is finished, Zorth. Surrender, and maybe your people will survive what comes next." Zorth laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a spark, Terran. And I am the storm that will extinguish you." The duel that followed was brutal, a clash of strength and will. Zorth was a monster, his strikes powerful enough to shatter stone. Kale was no match for him physically, but he fought with a cunning born of desperation. He used the environment to his advantage, luring Zorth into traps and exploiting his overconfidence. The fight was a blur of motion and light, each strike and counter-strike echoing through the chamber. Finally, with a roar of defiance, Kale found his opening. He drove his blade into Zorth's chest, piercing the armor that had seemed impenetrable. Zorth staggered, his glowing eyes dimming as he fell to his knees. "You will regret this," he rasped, his voice fading. Then he collapsed, his body crumpling like a broken machine. As the Dominion's leadership fell, the Spire's secrets were revealed. Hidden within its archives were records of the Dominion's darkest experiments, their plans for domination, and the truth of their ancient wars. The knowledge was both a weapon and a warning, a glimpse into the horrors that had shaped the Velker and the dangers that still lay ahead. Velker Prime burned in the aftermath of the battle. The once mighty cities were reduced to smoldering ruins, their towering spires crumbling into the ash-choked sky. The Dominion, for all its power, had fallen. Its warlords scattered, its fleets in disarray. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy was free from their iron grip. The Terran fleet, battered but victorious, gathered in orbit. The ironclad drifted among them, its hull scorched and pitted but still standing. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the unyielding spirit of humanity. Kale stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond. The weight of victory pressed heavily on his shoulders. The cost had been unimaginable, countless lives lost, entire worlds scarred by war. But they had prevailed. Humanity had proven that it would not bow, that it would not break. Admiral Myra joined him, her expression somber. "It's over," she said softly. Kale shook his head. "No. This is just the beginning. The galaxy is in chaos, and we have to rebuild. We have to be better than they were." Myra nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "And if they come back? If something worse rises from the ashes?" Kale's gaze hardened. "Then we'll be ready. Humanity will never kneel again." The ironclad turned slowly, its engines flaring as it moved into the void. Behind it, Velker Prime burned, a reminder of the cost of freedom. Ahead lay the stars, vast and uncharted, filled with both danger and promise. and as the ship disappeared into the darkness, it carried with it the hopes of a new dawn, a future forged in fire, but unbroken.